Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Asked for a second date by I don't know, I just work here. The story happened to me when I was 16. I'm a female. I was awkward and honestly not a lot of people had shown interest in me. I say this to show that when I did get asked out for the first time, I may have ignored some red flags because of the excitement and lack of experience I had. I met, let's call him Ryan, who was 18, at a school event where all the members of the same club from different schools got together to play games at a park. It was a lot of fun. I talked to a lot of people, but there was one person who was kind of on the outside of the crowd. I introduced myself and made small talk. The only thing I remember from this conversation is that when I asked what his favorite class was, he said chemistry, because I like to blow stuff up. I think I just thought this was a joke and laughed it off. By the end of the event, I had gotten a few people's Snapchats, including Ryan's. That same night, he texted me and asked me out to coffee. The next day, I did my makeup all nice and wore my favorite outfit. I was just so excited that someone asked me out on my dream first date, a coffee date. I got to the date, and it was awkward at first. I was leading most of the conversation, and he was pretty quiet. Eventually, we both got more comfortable with the situation and were having a good time. I don't remember how we got to this topic, but he mentioned the recent Florida shooting. We both agreed that it was tragic, but he understood where the shooter was coming from, and he didn't understand why he was getting so much hate. I responded, he's getting so much hate because he killed people. At that point, I was super creeped out, and I made up a lie that I had to leave. After the date, I told my friends about how much he freaked me out and that he gave me school shooter vibes. They had also been at the school event and knew who he was. We kind of laughed it off, and everyone agreed that I had dodged a bullet. It had been about a week since our date. He had Snapchatted with me a few times to see how I was doing, and I kept my responses short but still polite. He eventually asked me out again for another coffee date, and I declined the offer and made up some excuse that I was busy. Not even 10 minutes after I declined his offer, I got a text from one of my friends with a screenshot of an article. It read, "Student arrested for alleged bomb threats at blank high school," and it had his mugshot. After reading the article, I figured out he had been arrested 3 days earlier and was now out on bail. I was absolutely stunned. I didn't know what to do. Admittedly, I made some poor jokes with my friends about how the date blew me away and how our connection was explosive. Humor was just how I coped with things in high school. But my biggest mistake was changing his contact information to the bomb emoji. I know that was stupid. I had blocked him on Snapchat, but I still had his phone number saved for some reason. We had never talked on text, so I didn't block his number. After I blocked him on Snapchat, I received some texts. One said, "I'm sorry. If you hear about me on the news, it just stresses me out and I didn't mean it. I have a lot of anxiety and depression. I was going to tell you that." At that point, I was still taking this as a joke and not really getting how serious it all was. I thought as long as I didn't respond, things would be fine. Another few days went by, and I thought that was the end of this horrible date story. It was a school day and I was asleep. At about 6 a.m., I woke up to my phone ringing. I was so startled by it, I didn't put on my glasses. I do have horrible eyesight. I looked down at my phone and saw a black dot instead of a phone number. So I answered the phone and said, "Hello?" There was just silence on the other end. I looked down again and realized that the black dot was actually a bomb emoji. I yelled out, "Oh shit!" and I hung up the phone. Right after I hung up, I got another text. It read, "I went to jail last week. Letting you know that I'm not a bad person. I just have a lot of issues with school and fake friends. I'm always at the bottom of the food chain because people make fun of me for how I dress and kind of rude things. That's what led this rage on, and I'm very stressed, and I'm sorry." At that point, I didn't think it was funny anymore, and I blocked his phone number. After all of this, I was very anxious and worried that our date was more meaningful to him than I thought, and he was clearly not in jail anymore. I only told my friends, and we made jokes, but I was definitely freaked out after the phone call. I wish this was the end of the story, but there is more that happened after I blocked him. Months after this, I was at the mall and I was walking between stores when I saw Ryan, walking in the opposite direction. I got out my phone and got a picture of him to prove to myself that it was the same person. It was a shitty photo of him walking away, but it was definitely the same haircut and build. I quickly ducked into one of the stores and went to the back of it. I was just panicked and I didn't know what to do, if it was him, or if he recognized me. As I collected myself, I saw him walk into the store that I was in. It was a Forever 21, which are very large and usually have 2 entrances. I quickly and calmly left out of the other exit. I left to my car and drove away. I'm choosing not to include the article and mugshot because I don't want people to get his real name and where he's from. While I don't respect his actions, I still do not wish this person any harm, and I truly wish him the best. I'm sharing this because I do think in retrospect I was being a dumbass and made some stupid decisions that made the situation worse. Uncle Josh note, you're not being a dumbass, and maybe you did make some stupid decisions, but I think he made the situation pretty bad all on his own. Glad you're okay. That's Not My Dog by T. Bev. I've been hesitant to share this story. I've always believed it was a paranormal experience, but when telling the story to others, it's hard not to brush it off as just a dog or just my imagination. But I wasn't the only one to experience it, and I've heard so many others tell similar stories. When I was between the ages of 6 and 11, my younger sister, mom, dad, and I lived on a large farm. My parents rented the place, and though much of the land was used for farming by the landowners, there weren't any actual farm animals on the property. There were acres upon acres of farmland, buildings and barns that hadn't been used in many years, and acres of forest that we used for hunting at the rear of the property. Being the independent Indiana Jones-loving tomboy I was, it was heaven, and I spent most days out there wandering the area alone. Now, even though there weren't any farm animals, our family did have pets. There were a ton of indoor and outdoor cats that just kind of showed up, and our Labrador mix Ajax. Ajax was a big black mutt who still reigns as the best dog I've ever had in my life. He was so big he played with a bowling ball, rolling it up and down the driveway. He also liked to dunk the more troublesome tomcats in mud puddles. He was awesome. I think I was 8 or 9 when this incident happened. As usual, I was out exploring. I knew my intention was to go into the hayloft in the biggest of the barns. My friend and I were supposed to go up into it earlier that day, but he chickened out. So there I was at dusk, walking down the long lane back to the black barn, thinking about what would lay before me after I climbed that wooden ladder. I do need to mention there were so many buildings we named them by color or what we thought they were for, like sheep barn, grain barn, red barn, etc. I was playing with a blade of long grass in my hands and looking down at it when I heard a low growl. Honestly, I thought it was the wind at first. Looking up, I saw a big black dog blocking the lane. Obviously, at first I thought it was Ajax, my big black dog. I called out and began walking towards him when I heard the growl again. It was a low growl so deep it felt like it made my chest vibrate. Maybe I was just being stupid, but I still thought this was Ajax. I started trying to placate him. "What's wrong, boy? You okay, buddy?" While still taking hesitant steps towards him. As I got closer, I realized just how much bigger this dog was than Ajax. I remember feeling an icy cold drape over me. This huge black dog was using his body to block my path. Head turned towards me, growling, with his back arched up and his front paws stretched out as if ready to lunge. Immediately upon realizing that this thing was not my dog, I saw Ajax's head out of the corner of my right eye as he came up to stand next to me. Ajax didn't growl. I turned my head to look at him, and I heard my dad behind me say, "Don't move," in his own human sort of growl. I swear the next few seconds played back in my head like some sort of movie. I was still looking at the dog that wasn't mine, his eyes as black as his fur, when I heard the clicking sound of Dad putting the rifle to his shoulder and hitting the safety. That was the moment I lost all my will. I turned back towards my dad and ran the few steps to him, and in those few steps I heard Ajax bark and the gun go off. But I didn't see anything. My arms were wrapped around my dad's waist, and my face buried in his beer belly. Dad dropped the gun from his shoulder and put his hand on my shoulder, pulling me away from him and making me turn back towards the dog. While to some it may seem harsh to make your young daughter stare at the dog you just killed, it was pretty normal with my dad and family. The thing was, the dog wasn't there. It wasn't lying dead or running down the lane towards the forest or headed to the black barn. I looked at Ajax, who was still looking in the direction the black dog had been, with the fur on the back of his neck raised. And then I looked back up at my dad, with what I'm sure was a very shocked look on my face. All he said was, "It's gone. Don't go to the black barn again." I don't know how he'd known I'd been in the barn earlier that day because he had been at work, or how he could have known that's where I was going at that time because there were a bunch of buildings back there. I'm going to preface the rest of this story with this. Just about the only thing my dad had in common with when I was growing up was a sensitivity to the paranormal and a love of reading. We didn't talk much, but when we did, it was usually about one of those two subjects, and after he'd had a few drinks. So here's the thing. We didn't talk about this right afterward. We were silent during the long walk back to the house that night, but we did talk about it a few weeks later. Living out in a rural area, you get used to predators like coyotes, foxes, and even raccoons. Man, those things can be vicious. And having a lot of barn cats, you get used to them disappearing, either running off or falling prey to one of the aforementioned predators. So one time at dinner, my sister mentioned a cat she hadn't seen for a while, and I commented, "I bet it was the black dog." And my dad said immediately, "Yeah, probably." I recognized this as my window and asked him about it after dinner. He told me that he'd seen that thing, as he called it, a couple of times before. He said it started by seeing it out of the corner of his eyes while he was hunting in the forested back acres, and later saw it coming out of the black barn when he was pulling in after work one night. He said it was always at dawn or dusk when he saw it, when the light was low. I specifically asked him about the incident a couple of weeks before. What happened to the dog? Where did it go? And he said, and I swear I will never forget the sound of his voice when he said this for the rest of my life, it was just smoke. There was no dog. But after our conversation weeks later, I knew there was a dog. And to this day, it still terrifies me to know that that thing could still be out there. Followed Around a Car Park by Gigi. This felt truly like something from a horror movie. I'm looking for possible answers of closure, And I've since told the police about this, and the police asked me why I didn't call them as it was happening. Me and my friend were in a dark car park by a lake in my city. The lake is surrounded by various car parks and trees. The closer you get to the lake, the further you are from the main road, which takes you out of the wooded area. My friend and I were parked 5 minutes from the lake with the car facing it. We were sitting there listening to music and chatting for about 10 minutes, with me in the driver's seat with the ignition turned off, when all of a sudden, my friend who was looking out my driver's side window said to me, "Is that a man standing there?" I laughed and looked ahead, but all I saw was the dark lake in front of me, and I said, "No." But he pointed his finger at my driver's side window, and I turned my head and saw a man with a cat mask covering the top half of his face, standing about 10 meters away, staring at me and not moving. I immediately was extremely freaked out. I mean, the way he was standing and staring at us through the mask was so unnerving. I immediately started my car as quickly as I could, to which this man started running towards my driver's side door at full speed. Thankfully, my doors were locked, and he stood no chance against my car. But just as we breathed a small sigh of relief that the car was now moving, we saw a white ute following closely behind my car. Now, as I mentioned, we were in this wooded area with dirt roads and several turns which I was not familiar with. Each turn we made, which were all wrong turns unfortunately, the car followed us. We were screaming the whole way and not sure what they wanted from us, and eventually, the worst thing that possibly could have happened, happened. I made the wrong turn in a dead-end part of the car park, and the white ute parked on an angle, essentially blocking me in. At that point, I was genuinely fearing for my life, and the masked man appeared from the forest, coming at my car quick. I drove around, nearly hitting him, and managed to weasel past the ute that was parked on the angle. I finally drove out of there going the right way and got onto the main road. The scariest part to me now is wondering what they wanted from us. It felt more like a prank considering the whole car pursuit and attempt to block us in. I don't know if they had any weapons or whatever in their car. I thought it was possibly an attempted carjacking, but if that was the case, I feel like there would have been more efficient means of doing so.
Hoofy, A True Story by Via 1999. This is an old story told to me from a few years ago. I was just reminded of it a couple of days back when retelling it, and I'm curious if anyone else has ever heard of this, or if it was made up by the person who told me. I used to work at a maximum security prison where I was in charge of overseeing the production of food. Not a CO by any means, but I was able to talk to the inmates very frequently. One early morning, I was doing paperwork when one of the inmates was doing some sort of stocking, and we were talking about urban legends. This man was Native American, I think Navajo, but I could be wrong. I'm going to call him Storm for the rest of this story. Storm told me about a legend and an experience that he had had on his reserve about some sort of devil. A devil called Hoofy. Storm claimed that there was a handsome man with a tall white cowboy hat and boots that frequently went into casinos. He didn't gamble. He flirted with beautiful young women and lured them out of the casino. Once he took those women to his home, he transformed into a tall creature with shaggy goat legs and long black hair. His beautiful face turned into a mix of a demonic horse and a wolf with piercing red eyes. He would then devour those women and left their clothing around his homestead as a memento of his killing. I laughed because it sounded like a typical monster. But Storm got serious and then told me that he had a close encounter with Hoofy, and he barely made it out alive. Storm and his cousin lived on a reservation in Arizona, on the other side of South Mountain, very close to my hometown in Estrella Mountain. One day he and his cousin were drinking and trying to pass the time as there wasn't much to do. They decided to take a walk into the desert just for the hell of it. Again, not much else to do. It was about half an hour or so from sundown, so the two tread off in a direction and enjoyed the scenery of the plain desert. They walked for about 15 minutes or so when they came across an abandoned church-like building. It was old and decrepit with weak wooden structures that looked as though a stiff wind could break down the entire thing. The two walked through the church and out the back, walking through broken pews and the floor creaking with every step. They laughed about how freaky and weird this old building was before slowly making their way out. They walked out the door and jumped over a trench just past the back end of the church and continued to walk and laugh when they came across something strange. Storm said that he saw a wide arrangement of shoes, muddied red high heels, black flats, torn brown pumps, an assortment of women's shoes scattered around them that were broken and dirty, clearly abandoned for some time. Storm picked up a shoe to inspect it when he turned to his cousin. The look on his cousin's face was that of complete and utter horror. His face was pale and his eyes were wide, close to tearing, and he was looking behind Storm. Storm was about to turn around when his cousin stopped him. "No," he whispered, placing his hands on Storm's shoulders. "Don't look. Keep your head down, man." Frightened, Storm followed his cousin's word. He had never seen his cousin so freaked out. But then he heard it. A pair of heavy footsteps walking behind him. The sound of labored breathing matching with the steps, and Storm felt as though his whole body felt 10 degrees colder. His shoulders were shaking when his cousin pulled his hand and stepped back slowly. "We need to go." His voice was nearly lost in the heavy steps behind him, but Storm heard him just barely. "Whatever you do, don't look back," was the last thing his cousin told him before he booked it. The pair ran as fast as they could, sprinting past the old church and running to their homestead. His cousin yelled out native prayers in hopes that some sort of ancestral guardian could stop this beast. All the while, Storm could hear the galloping of hooves behind them, the feeling of the creature's breathing against the back of his neck. Hot and sticky breath, smelling of rotten flesh, motivating to keep running no matter how tired he got. For all he knew, he would be this creature's next meal if he slowed down one bit. They ran, cutting the time back to their home in half. And they did make it back inside safely just as the sun was setting, bathing their home in a warm orange glow. Panting against the wall, Storm placed a hand over his fast-beating heart. Scared of what he might see, but he had to know, Storm stumbled to an outside window and pulled back a blind, peering out into the dusking landscape. In the direction that they had come from, Storm could see the back of the creature walking away. He said it was 8 feet tall easily, with long, silky black hair that reached to its waist. Where human legs should have been, a pair of long goat-like legs were, with black stamping hooves that kicked up the dust as it walked away. Missing Heads by Daughter of Saturn. I grew up in the woods in a secluded area, and the house and property we lived on was a hotbed for paranormal activity and strange occurrences. I honestly believe the land was cursed by Native Americans hundreds of years ago. Anyway, we always had a ton of pets and even had a small personal farm with all sorts of animals. For some reason, though, we had horrible luck keeping anything alive. Our pets would die in the strangest of accidents and gruesome ways. Nothing would live long, and we constantly dealt with death. So, obviously, with so many deaths, we began to grow quite a large pet cemetery in our backyard. What was strange and unexplainable was what happened after we buried them. I remember going to visit the grave of a recently buried pet, and noticing that it was dug up, and its head was missing. This happened every time, and we all thought it was a fox or some other wild animal. This went on for years, and it left us completely confused and honestly creeped out. One day, one of our dogs, who was very old at that point and on his way out, was put down at the vet, and we brought him home to bury him. We wrapped him in a white blanket and had to dig a very big hole because he was a huge dog, about 6 feet in length, and he also weighed a lot. 2 days later, after we buried him, my sister and I made our way out back to visit the dog's grave. As we approached, I noticed something was off. There was a pile of dug-up dirt, and there was some white sheet exposed from the ground. Something had dug up our dog, and it dug where the head was located and took it from the body, while leaving the body still buried and untouched. That immediately scared me to death because I now knew this was not a fox or some other wild animal, because there was nothing that would have been able to take that head considering the size of my dog. It was completely impossible. That left us feeling creeped out and wondering what could possibly have done that and why it was doing it. I also mentioned because of the horrible luck we had with animals, we really began to think there was something wrong with us and couldn't understand how this constantly happened and what we were doing wrong. After finally moving away years and years later, we now had 0 issues with pets dying, and they all managed to live out to older ages. Thus we realized it wasn't us, but something was seriously wrong with that property that was impacting the animals. And I do have to mention, it wasn't just animals either. My baby brother also died on that property. He suffocated while lying in bed and was unable to be resuscitated. Another incident that happened in the middle of the night. A priest was driving down the highway when he suddenly struck a telephone pole next to our mailbox, and his car drove up the pole, shooting it up in the air, which he was then ejected out of, right through the windshield. He died in our front yard. I remember finding his Bible the next day in the grass. We almost didn't make it either. One cold January night while my dad was away in another state working, my siblings and I, along with my mom, were all huddled up in the living room near the wood-burning stove, keeping warm while we camped out with pillows and blankets, just watching movies. I had been asleep, but suddenly woke up and said calmly, "The house is on fire." This startled my mom, which prompted her to investigate. And our house was in fact on fire. We all managed to run out with just the clothes on our back, but the house, which was 300 years old and made of cedar, went up like a match and literally burned to the ground, not leaving even a beam behind. If I hadn't woken up to say that, we would most likely have been killed from that fire, especially how fast it happened. That land had a history of tragedy, and even in the current day, it continues to harvest more negative energy by destroying everything that steps foot on it, causing more torment and pain. It's been 19 years since I moved away, and I still to this day constantly dream of the property, multiple times a month, and my siblings and mother do as well. Honestly, it's like we can't escape it.
After Work Drinks by Plain Priority. I was around 17 at the time, and this was a few years ago, and I was working in Topman. There was a sale on, and as you can imagine, it was chaotic. I worked in a rough area in London, but I'd lived around there for years, so nothing really fazed me. That area is notorious for gang activity and stabbings, but it was still home. I usually worked alone in my side of the shop, Top Shop being on the other side. I was frantic at the tills, processing purchases, and a man came to the desk and looked distressed. He must have been in his 50s, had a black puffer coat on and joggers. "I lost my phone," he said, pointing to the sale rack to the right of the store. I followed him as he walked over to the rack. It was 2 racks of clothes pushed quite close to each other. I looked under the racks, and there it was. His phone was placed perfectly in the middle of the racks. There was no way it could have fallen like that. I just picked it up and passed it to him. "Thank you so much, my angel, my angel, my angel," he said, seeming very theatrical with his actions. "It's okay, no problem," I said, as I turned to go back to the till. "How can I repay you?" he asked as I turned. "You really don't have to," I said. "It only took a second." I said that smiling, and then he asked me what time I finished work. I lied and said 3 o'clock, even though I was on close that day, and at that point it was around 10 a.m. "I'll see you after work," he said, with a straight face as he walked out of the shop. I shrugged it off and continued my long and chaotic shift. It came to closing time around 8 p.m. My colleagues and I were locking up and starting to leave together. As I got out of the doors, I noticed the guy, the same man as earlier, sitting on a bench looking at us. I started to follow my colleagues. I was pretty quiet and didn't really socialize much with them, and I was trailing a bit behind. The guy got up and said to me that he wanted to take me for a drink to thank me. And I explained that I had to get back, and that I was actually 17, so I couldn't drink. I turned to walk away, and he grabbed my arm, ushering me down an alleyway, insisting I come for a drink. I looked down the alleyway to see a blacked-out SUV with a guy holding the door open. I tried to pull away from him, and he grabbed my arm again. This was on a high street with loads of shops around, so there were a few people around. I was still trying to be nice to him as I declined multiple times, as my naive 17-year-old self was, until his face dropped and he pulled me towards the alleyway. Fight or flight finally kicked in, and I threw myself on the floor. He let go and I sprinted to the bus stop. I then told my boyfriend, and he came and picked me up from the bus stop. I don't know why, but I never called the police or anything. I told my mom a couple of years later, and she told me how serious that really was. For some reason, it never really occurred to me, and I had brushed it off previously. Thankfully, nothing serious happened that night.
Can a Painting Be Haunted? By In the TARDIS. This story is about a painting that my mother brought home from an auction when I was about 8. My parents imported and exported antiques and fine wines for many years. Now it's just antiques. My mother, Natasha, is Russian-born but grew up in the U.S. from the age of 3, and always had the love of anything old and unusual when it came to furniture and artwork, something that seems to have rubbed off on me a little. My parents would regularly go to auctions and estate sales and the like to purchase interesting pieces for their business. It was rare that anything purchased at these sales ever made it home to become part of our house, unless it was out of the ordinary, or my parents liked it too much to part with it. My childhood home looked like a cross between a madman's idea of a yard sale and an antiques market belonging to an insane hoarder. But it made for good fun and interesting conversation. And many good forts. None of the furniture or artwork previously had bothered me as far as I can remember, until my mother purchased a painting by an unknown artist. It hadn't been signed, and research has never uncovered who painted it or who the subject actually was. All we knew was that the family who put it in the auction bought the home they had found it in, and didn't like the painting or several pieces of furniture that the last owners had left behind. So, off to the sales they went. It was a rather large lot of over 50 items. My mother purchased the painting and a sideboard full of silverware and plates of varying ages locked inside. We got them open after we got it home, and it was strange as my mother had been told that the hutch was empty. Not so much as it turned out. But back to the painting. It was of a woman about 30 years old. Maybe older, but it was hard to tell. She was wearing a long blue-gray gown and stood in a veranda of an old house. Next to her was a table with a tea set and kettle, and what looked like some cake or sandwiches on a plate. There were some flowers in a chair and part of a window. I mean, whoever did the painting had a lot of talent, as the detail was incredible. It was probably painted around 1900 or 1910, judging by the fashion she was wearing. My mother brought it home, and we hung it in the hallway next to my parents' bedroom, between the main bathroom and a little room my dad used to do his paperwork in. I felt very strange around the painting from the first day it was hung up. The hallway in summer was comfortable and not too warm, but after the painting was hung up, everything around the painting in that area turned almost ice cold. Passing the painting, I'd get goosebumps on whatever exposed skin I had. I also started feeling like the lady in the painting was watching me. My twin sisters started saying that they didn't like looking at the painting as it made them feel uncomfortable, like they weren't meant to be around it. My baby brother would walk on the other side of the hallway to get away from it, and when asked why, he said he didn't like the lady, and that he was cold when he looked at her. And he was 5, nearly 6 at the time. Soon, things went past just feelings in the hallway. At night, we started hearing whispers that hadn't been there previously. Our house already had had its share of spooky behavior, but we had gotten used to that. But this was new. A movement of a flash of blue-gray like the dress out of the corner of your eye. A strange touch occasionally in the hallway when no one else was around. I mean, that may sound something like Tales from the Crypt, but I assure you, this isn't something that I saw on TV, and sometimes I wish it was. After my father, who was 6'5" and 350 pounds, got a cold hand running up his back when he was in the shower, there was any real notice of what we all had said to our parents. Used to other ghosts in the house, we at first thought, oh, it's just another spirit making itself known to us as it's new here. But then things got bad. Fast. My baby brother, I'll call him Adam, was tripped on the stairs and pushed by a cold hand when he tried to get up again. A big fern we had in the hall next to the painting suddenly started dying. It was over 20 years old and had never had any previous problems. When we moved it away from the painting, it went back to being fine, and it's still alive today. But one side of it looks a little mangled. That was the side facing the painting, and it never was the same. The branches grew back weird, like something had infected them. It was checked out and tested by a plant specialist, and even they couldn't find anything wrong with the old plant. Our dogs Frankie and Dex, both terrier mixes, would never go past the painting without whining or growling at it. They were normally very placid, gentle dogs. Even our aunt's dog Lula, a poodle, had to be carried past the painting when we used to babysit her. She wouldn't walk past it or even look at it. Our cats tried to claw at the painting one time when it fell off its hook onto the ground. Our normally placid Maine Coon cats, Sally and Meg, both went nuts trying to scratch it until we took it away. And eventually the painting started coming off the hook every night and sat against the wall upright every morning when no one had touched it. My mother, a very spiritual person who put up with our friendly spirits in the house with a grain of salt as they didn't bother her, decided this painting had to go and that something was wrong with it, to which we all agreed. So off to the auctions it went. Several times. My mother, who knew the buyers, found out that they only kept it a month. They too heard whispers, and their cat also attacked the painting, so they gave it to a neighbor who liked it. That neighbor sold it after her dog freaked out around it. The painting kept getting sold on or auctioned or given away until 2014, when a man who collected art in Florida bought the painting and didn't know its history. Having again tried to research its past, he only found out it was possibly a painting of an artist's wife who had died young. I don't know if that's true or not. There's no real record of the artwork anywhere, and as I mentioned, it's not signed. The man who owned it last, I heard, keeps it in his basement, as it frightens his grandchildren. He says he won't sell it on and keeps it locked up. I think he too knows something isn't right with it, and I'm worried as he's old what's going to happen when he dies. That painting, I think, isn't safe. Either a ghost is in it or attached to it, and it's certainly not friendly. So please, anyone who sees this painting, let me know. It really should be destroyed. I know it probably sounds like a made-up story for kids that I'm telling you, and an adult man like myself shouldn't be wary of an old oil painting of someone unknown. But I feel in my heart that that painting is dangerous. If you buy it, please destroy it. It's really not worth the trouble. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you've got a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, hey, why not? If you have the time, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment in the section below. I'd love to hear what you think of the stories. Follow me on social media, there's links to that in the description. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel a step further, find a link to my Patreon page down there, or consider purchasing some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. There's a link to my TeePublic storefront down there. All those cool designs make really great holiday gifts. And speaking of the holidays, if you've got a cool Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, New Year's story, send it my way. I will be putting together a holiday special as usual. Would love to have your story. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.